When I was a kid, I discovered that I had great prestige in the neighborhood. My friends could ask me to draw anything, which turned out to be almost in all cases naked ladies. They would describe the exact position and physical characteristics, and I could do that on request. Sort of a short transition between that beginning and what eventually became my career. Well, people ask me why I chose design like most American artists. When I was a kid, I copied comic strips, Walt Disney, and then I went to the High School of Music and Art, which gave me a lot of options about what I should be doing, where I was introduced to the idea of what was then called commercial art, which was making things to sell for money. At the same time, parallel to that was this other idea of fine art, which was about some other kind of value. But I never could get the idea through my head that I could make a living making paintings that somebody would buy and put in their house. It just seems so weird to me and so inappropriate for me. I wanted to do work that was public. I wanted to do work that was on the street. I wanted to do work that people saw. At that point, I had already internalized this idea that it didn't matter whether I was called an artist or a designer or an illustrator or whatever else it was. The core value was always the act of making things and the transformation of an idea that you hold in your mind that becomes real or material. That to me still is the glory of any creative activity.
As the creator of I Love New York and the moving sequel that followed 9/11. He may be the best known graphic designer in the world, but they don't begin to even hint at the impact and significance of Milton Glaser's work. He's taken the gifts he had to start with and developed them along a dazzling variety of lines that have influenced every serious designer I can think of, and that have materially affected the way we get information, the way we buy things, and in fact, the things that we buy. I've known Milton about 30 years, and I remember being struck by the mixture of talent, play, and intelligence.
I love doing posters. In fact, all designers love doing posters. Most of the time, you're working on 5.5 by 8.5, and suddenly you have this enormous landscape, which just gives you a different kind of opportunity and presence. I love music in all forms. So I'm very responsive to music experientially. I love to dance when my feet would still obey my brain. And I think that idea of movement and a rhythmic response has something to do with the way you draw and the way you make things. I always tend to think that the affinities between all these forms are very constant. And also, I would like to see whether it's possible to create the same kind of emotional response in graphics that music has.
It occurs to me that for many people, this poster is as much the sixties as anything they know about the sixties. People very often remember this way, whether they were there or not.
When you think of a Dylan poster, that really speaks to a generation. It wasn't his generation, but he was able to understand what was happening and see what was happening and make work about in response to what was happening. That's very unusual. And I see the same thing in the poster for Tony Kushner for Angels in America. To take the raw pain of a generation of gay men who are all dying and transform it into a piece of art. His closeness to our culture, to our civilization, really allowed him to change the design world.
His influence is one of a real star, and there aren't that many stars in the design field, particularly in the graphic design field. Designers their work is seen, but they're not necessarily heard because Milton is so articulate, so damn articulate. His voice is requested in many places. So between the voice, the work, and the presence, he's known in many places all over. And because the world itself, this small world, is so interested in design, and design becomes this kind of Esperanto. Milton speaks the Esperanto well.
Back in the mid-70s, there was a collapse of well-being and morale in this town. Nobody wanted to be here. And the city and the state had gotten very apprehensive about what was going on. A guy was hired and he said, look, we got a line. I love New York. But we need a visual thing to go with it. Can you help us? So he did a funny thing with 2 lozenges, and it was just typographical. And that was the end of the job, I thought. And then a day or 2 later, I was in a taxi, and I very often carry a scrap of paper with me. I say, you know, there's a better way to do that. Yeah, that would be better. The world was waiting for it. I explained to students in terms of understanding communication that the creation of a puzzle is one of the tools that you have to make people understand things. When they activate the mind to try to figure something out, the likelihood is that they will remember and respond to it more than if they're told something directly. And in the case I Love New York, which seems so simple, I is a word, complete word in itself. Heart is a symbol for a feeling, and NY are initials for a place. And because of that simple little trick of activating the problem-solving impulse of the brain, it stuck in people's mind. They saw it once, they remembered it. I have made nothing on I Heart or I Love New York ever. There have been no cash rewards as a consequence of doing it. On the other hand, it really makes me feel very, very proud to have taken part in that shift in the city's consciousness from being indifferent to itself to realizing we love this place. I've been in this building since 1965. And one of the reasons I'm here is because it faces the schoolyard outside. So every day at 12 o'clock, you hear this burst of energetic voices. I'm always embarrassed when people come because it doesn't look like a design office with beautiful furniture and fancy fixtures. And one thing you'll notice is that I'm sitting along with everybody else in this undifferentiated space. And I realized that in part that was because of the way I grew up in a 3-room apartment in the Bronx. And my father would be sitting at one corner reading the newspaper, and my mother would be sitting in the opposite corner. She would be sewing socks and shirts, and my sister would be sitting on the couch doing her homework. Most of the room was occupied by this enormous dining table that we only use once a year at Passover. And of course, we were all listening to the radio at the same time. So ever since then, I've always worked in a room surrounded by everybody else. I have never written a memo in my life because everybody here can hear everything that occurs. That saves a lot of time.
I remember him on the phone in his office, and I came down with a new manuscript and was waiting to talk to him. He just motioned me over, read the first 3 paragraphs while he was talking on the phone, and made a sketch. Milton said we should always operate by interruption.
We had about 100 people in this building, if you can imagine such a thing, running the magazine for the first 3 or 4 years.
We were on the floor of this building, the 4th floor. It has 1 bathroom, and there were 30 or 40 people up there. It was amazing, and everybody was just crammed trying to get this magazine from Monday to Thursday to a printer. And this is well before computers. And we would be talking on a Wednesday in which we didn't have a cover story, we didn't have this story, and we didn't have that story. And Clay is on the phone yelling at Jimmy Breslin and Tom Wolfe or anybody else that was not delivering in time. Milton was the one who was able to say, don't worry, we can do it. If something fell through, he'd do the illustration. He gave me a real education in the first year at New York. The editor was Clay Felker. Milton and Clay had founded the magazine themselves. Milton was the chairman and the kind of editorial force in terms of service. He kind of reinvented, if it had been invented in the first place, service journalism. Our mantra was be on the reader's side. Not the store owner's side, not the subject side. If we were going to do a story on Macy's or we were going to do a story on a little food shop, it wasn't that we were trying to promote that food shop. It was trying to tell the reader how to cope or to deal with that and how to get the best out of it, especially in the area of teaching them how to, or learning with them how to cope with New York City, the pastrami Olympics and the underground gourmet and things like that. This is one of the first covers Milton and I worked on together. You can see it's October 1968. The hardest thing was getting Gloria, who wrote the story, to sit in this Nixon box. And later, we helped her with the Ms. There's one thing that, to this day, Milton and I were too stupid to realize then. Here we have this magazine that Gloria created, and we're presenting. Should have been a woman's hand holding this magazine. And it's not.
What you had in New York Magazine was what was happening in New York City, what was alive and kicking in New York City, and what energy was flowing through, and what food was coming through, and what dance was coming through. And you still see that in New York Magazine and Time Out. It's a way of thinking about life where without a filter, really. And you see that in every magazine in every major city in the world. But it's really only one tiny example of the way that he's changed our lives.
And so the building has had a bit of history connected with it. It's kind of a bit of a collective. Now I have a little business with Walter Bernard. We do editorial design upstairs. And we've done many, many magazine and newspaper projects together. And we still do. We worked on the design of Descent together. And while I once had a very big studio when I was doing supermarket work, we had 45 people here, but it did not make me happy. I like the scale of the work as we now do it. We have very talented people at the studio, the kind of people that you want to surround yourself with. We are doing a new identity under the pressure from these young people who say we are perceived as being fuddy-duddies. I'll show you our old identity, which was based on Russian constructivism. you see that contrary to most designs, that this emphasizes perhaps the least important thing, which is the number on the building. It obliterates everything else. Anyhow, we always liked this because it was perverse. So I did this poster for a lecture I did, but I thought there was something nice about the symmetry of my name, Milton Glaser. With Molly, we did a little version of it just in one color. I'm interested in work that doesn't exactly look as though it was designed, that it sort of looks as though it happened. I always like that idea that people have to work to understand what you're showing it.
In 1996, we were asked to redesign Fortune. When we finished, John Huey, the editor, called and said, it's time to rethink the Fortune 500. So Milton and I literally sat over here working on 500, and we were both trying different things, Milton on paper and me on the computer occasionally. And I had this thought of only doing it in type, writing out the Fortune 500. And while it was very intriguing, it didn't have power from a distance. And Milton and I had also been playing with various ways of doing the big 500, and while some of them were really nice, they also simply said 500. And Milton said, why don't we combine the big number 5 and the word 100? Well, it has been used every year since. It is now the 10th anniversary of that cover. As John Huey says, it's Eustace Tilley, and each year it's used. Of course, I divide our fee into the years, and I realize that we've got paid about $3.
Thinking and making things, mostly I do in the country. Assembling and refining things we do here. So one is solitary, and the other's needs interaction. And I love this part of work. You have a partner, you sort of go for a dance, and you move one way, and the partner sort of responds. And it's so much more fun than doing things by yourself. We are repackaging something for a remarkable Brazilian pianist called João Carlos Martins. And our idea was that instead of dealing with Bach in a conventional sense, that we would deal with the idea of Brazil and the fact that ethnicity and location produces a different view of the music. What I'm thinking is if we just put that in the middle horizontally, we have a white panel above and below, and we just run our typography in that white panel.
Uncropped
yeah,
in the middle, okay.
Make it
I'll
run
make
right
it
through the
smaller.
middle.
All right.
We don't do it as finishing something according to plan, because what's nice is it changes as you do it. The energy comes out of a work that has been achieved as a result of making it, rather than as a premeditation and then completion, you know. I had designed that logo for the school for the 40th. So I got the mark I'd done, and I said, just give me a batch of these, and we just ran them off on our copier. And I pasted them all down, and it looked just like a Frank Stella, which wasn't bad. And then as I was pasting down, some of the edges were coming up. I said, you know, it sort of looks more interesting with the edges coming up. If I were doing this on the computer and it were not real piece of paper, it never would have happened. You could create this on the computer and the illusion, but you wouldn't have stumbled into it as a physical act. I've designed any number of typefaces, but they're not really typefaces. They're kind of an idea that is, although it's done frequently now, an idea about form that has been translated to a typeface. The most obvious function of typography is to convey a narrative. But there's another whole range of activity for typography, which is more decorative and more instrumental in communicating atmosphere. Well, I do a kind of novelty faces, which have a sort of premise and then a use for a headline or something else. It's a modest intervention into the world of typography. This is a nice picture. The two of us going to work on something. He was great. I had an odd friendship with Fouan. He spoke no English, I spoke no French, and we would have these long conversations. we would talk for hours without either of us having the other's language. And one day I said, you know, there's a good chance we've been misunderstanding ourselves all these years. So to celebrate that misunderstanding, we said, let's do a book where I start a drawing and you continue it, and then I continue your drawing and you continue, and it's a series with some degree of misunderstandings. A little bit like a series of improvisations. It's like you get a theme going and you just do variations on it, but it's sold very well in Europe. And of course, for me, it really is a document of my love and affection for a wonderful friend.
Milton probably has the most international reputation of any designer living today, in large part because he was at the center of such culturally explosive things, culturally diverse things, starting in the 60s. I mean, because of Milton, in large part, psychedelia exists. Because of Milton, in large part, this kind of postmodern sensibility exists. He played a role in all of these things, and all of these things got exported.
Of course, there was that big show at Bushman Studios early in my career, which alerted Europeans to the fact that there was a kind of new non-Swiss version of design happening in the United States. And as a result of that, I became relatively well known in Europe and South America and so on because of the kinds of assignments that I got afterwards.
We have done newspapers around the world. We've done La Vanguardia in Barcelona, ABC in Madrid, O Globo in Rio. We did Espresso in Rome twice, Barron's twice.
In France, we did L'Express for Sir James Goldsmith, who also owned a literary magazine called Lear, which we did. And there were innumerable others, Business Tokyo in Japan. But there was a time when I was popping back and forth to Europe often, and other places as well. I would think that one thing that travel did was simply amplify what was already present, which was an appetite for whatever the surroundings offered, whether they were cultural or visual or whatever else. I mean, you can't very well go to Barcelona and see Gaudi and come back unchanged. I mean, there are some things that travel just affects your nervous system so much that there's nothing that you can do to avoid it without even consciously wanting to emulate something. I would say in that way, travel penetrates your consciousness, but not in a rational way. A woman in Milano named Cristina Taverna decided to go into the publishing business as she thought she would publish the Divine Comedy. And I was disappointed because I wanted to do Hell, but then I realized Purgatory is much more interesting because that's where we are now. At any rate, I decided to do it in monoprints, which I hadn't done for many years. And so I took a course in Woodstock. The interesting thing about a monoprint, and the name itself reveals its limitation, is that you can only get one. Except if you do it on pieces of paper, you could rearrange it in the process of re-inking it so that it gives you a very nice way of doing a second version, but what you can't do is another print of the same thing. Works that are too preconceived tend to go dead, they become inert and less lively. Work that responds to the peculiarities of the moment tend to be more energized.
So some of those surprises are happy surprises.
Oh, absolutely. You have both
Yeah.
experiences. You know, sometimes it's much better than you thought it was going to be, like life itself. Sometimes it's much worse.
That's right.
I love doing a Purgatory. Perhaps the best things I've done in my later life, basically because they were dark. But I like the drama of the dark, and I like the idea of the conflict between good and evil. Finally, you get to a point where you realize everything is related to its opposite, that if you have light, there has to be darkness. If there's truth, there has to be lies. I mean, everything is defined by its opposite, and they both require exploration. I mean, if you simply do a drawing, a simple drawing, you're already dealing with questions of dark and light, right? So much of my work depends on drawing. I think of drawing as my essential resource, that's where my understanding of form comes from. And whenever I can draw, because I find it so pleasurable, I will draw.
You could just sit down in front of a piece of paper and you would start right away. What is it about drawing and line?
I am a great believer in drawing as a way of understanding the world. In fact, I was thinking for the book that you want to do of my drawings.
I do.
That a title might be Drawing is Thinking.
The idea is to make the hand do what you want. In his case, the hands have no resistance. The hands are inanimate tools without will of their own. And so the translation of image to drawing is automatic, complete, unmediated, instantaneous. To see it at work.
Well, it's funny, you know, one of the great things about being able to make pictures and drawings, it makes you feel like you're really like God. This drawing derives from a photograph of Monet and family, and all I really did was I put a snake in the foreground that clearly wasn't there. But I must say that it transforms everything. Once the snake enters it, you see everything shifts.
Much of your work is self-initiated.
Less than I would like, actually. I mean, I am so conditioned to working to a specific problem. But every once in a while, I have the opportunity to sort of do a cycle of work that I basically start myself. The Monet project was pretty extensive. There were over 50 drawings. All of these are events that could have happened, but didn't necessarily. Monet's dog. I don't know if he had a dog.
He goes now.
The truth is that I've been looking for a definition of what art is all my life without fully understanding exactly what it encompasses. But in the course of doing a speech, I looked up several references to what art was, and I found one by Horace, who was a critic and poet back in Roman times, first century or so. And he had this great line. He said, "The purpose of art is to inform and delight." And I thought, wow, it can't get much better than that.
You know, going back to the Bauhaus, there was this thing called the Gesamtkunstwerk, the whole total work of art. And I think that Milton comes out of that directly or indirectly, looking at art as art. And so the commercial is certainly one part of it that requires certain requisites. And then the artist part of him, the pure artist part of him, requires other requisites, but they're really joined. I mean, you can't separate the two. He might do pictures of his cats that are quite beautiful and have no place in a graphic design annual. But at the same time, he injects all of that artistic humanity into everything he does.
I started that project of doing the bureaus, and I realized that if I simply copying Piero's, what value does the band have? And then I realized if you looked at Piero as nature, like you're drawing a tree, you don't feel as though you're obliged to represent that tree, but that you just have an idea that the tree initiates. And so with the Piero projects, that's what it did. I sort of started drawing as though I were looking through a window at Piero. So otherwise, I would have been embarrassed to begin. Tom Rick in his great book, he says, there is no art. There are only artists. And you said, well, wait a minute, exactly. And what he meant, of course, is that what art is becomes defined generationally. Everybody sort of redefined what art is because there's no there, right?
Yeah, no, there.
It is, in fact, what society determines at any moment in history. And the great enemy of art, of course, is the institutionalization of belief, like style or like taste. We said, well, we finally got to it.
Yes.
Here we are. This is really art. And once that happens, that crystallization of belief, we're saying, okay, I got it now. You put 2 yellows, 1 red, and 3 of the green guys. Once that happens, you realize that becomes a limitation, right? When I had my show very early at the Museum of Modern Art that Emilio Ambas had arranged, there was one large poster, the big nude, that didn't have any typography on it. The curator of prints came in, he said, you can't show that. Doesn't have any typography on it. So what? Well, that makes it a print. And that comes under my jurisdiction. And I don't want that as representing the print. I said, I can't believe that. What I've always hated in my life is the parochialization of art, making it a special activity unrelated to other activities. It finally ends up as being an instrument for social enhancement and not what it really is, which is an expression of a very fundamental instinct of the species. There's a wonderful book that I have quoted for most of my life by Lewis Hyde called The Gift. And it basically says that this gift giving, which occurs in primitive cultures from one tribe to another, which is a device for pacifying others and establishing relationship, is what artists do. They basically create the commonalities, the symbolism, so that people feel as though they have some relationship to one another. When people don't feel that they have that relationship, they kill each other. So that role of providing common ground is absolutely essential to civilization. The nice thing about it is there's always a next plateau of understanding. It's very exciting to think that you don't run out, right? That history doesn't run out, that art doesn't run out. And so you just, you go as far as you can and then leave some room for the next guy. In junior high school, when I was deciding whether to go to Bronx Science or Music and Art, and I had a very encouraging science teacher, and I made the decision that I would go to Music and Art. And shortly after I'd made that decision, he stopped me in the hall one day. He said, I want to talk to you. And my heart sank. So I went into his office and he reached down into his desk and he pulled out a box of French Conte crayons. He gave it to me and he said, do good work. To some degree, everything I do has been supported by this idea that the only way I could really pay him back was to do good work. Well, this is my old high school, a high school of music and art. I received an exceedingly good education there. And a few years ago, the principal, Kim Bruno, asked me if I would do a new identity for the school. And the problem seemed to be the name of the school itself, which, if you can believe it, is the Fiorello H. LaGuardia High School of Music and Art and Performing Arts. My suggestion was that they change the name to LaGuardia Arts. And on that basis, I proceeded to design a logo that is based on the idea of musical score, and it is the only logo that can actually be sung. I entered the school at 15 because I came from junior high school. After there, I got into Cooper Union. And I must say, I received a wonderful, wonderful education. Well, Pushman grew out of an attempt to recreate the spirit and the energy of Cooper Union while we were students there. It was years later, after I had come back from Italy on my Fulbright, that we all decided we would like to continue to work together.
Pushpin gathered together some very demonstrative personalities, Milton Glaser, Seymour Quast, as the leaders. Ed Sorel was involved and others. And it created a stylistic buzz. It created an attitude. Pushpin was like the epitome of fun in design.
We worked from a different point of view. It was an eclectic point of view that celebrated ornament and drawing and narration, all the things that the modernists taught us to hate.
In that sense, Pushpin opened a door into eclecticism that no other firm had done, and did so in a sophisticated way. Pushpin had as a strategy to draw on these historical forms, these passé forms, bring them together, meld them, mold them, and make them into something that was highly contemporary.
I felt actually that our success had defined us too much. Pushpin had become a style, and I don't trust styles. And above all, I don't want to be encapsulated in a style. So it felt to me as though I would have to redefine myself. I really started Milton Glaser Inc. at that time, began to move into areas of restaurant design for Joe Baum, supermarket design for Sir James Goldsmith. And that required really transforming a small studio into a large studio, and still staying with all the activities of New York Magazine, which included acquiring the Village Voice and starting up New West Magazine. And we were very ambitious through all of that. It was a very, very busy time. And that kept me going for a good long time until Murdoch bought New York and we left. And I continued to do supermarkets for about 20 years. That's been a large part of my life, doing supermarkets. And I learned a lot from the act of doing that. I'm very happy with the work we did on supermarkets because it made life better for a lot of people, made things clearer. It made the navigation through the market more understandable and less fatigue. Also because you really had to talk to your average American all over the country. And that was very, very instructive. But the work we do is sort of aimed at a thin hierarchy of design interested personalities and other designers and fancy people and so on. But those years designing supermarkets were very fundamental in shaping my perception of how to communicate clearly. At that book event, at least 8 people came over to me at the event in publishing who said, I studied with you back 40 years ago. I love to teach. I don't think I have an obligation to teach. I teach because I feel better when I teach as when I don't teach. But I think what you've done in this presentation, you've really got there. It is withholding. It doesn't give you everything. It's just one of the secrets of design. People always ask me why I teach. And of course, the fact that people ask that question in itself just indicates the kind of low voltage contempt that teaching is actually held in America. The idea of being a teacher is that you've got to pass it on. You learn something, you develop some insights, your experience can be transmitted, and that is the nature of civilization.
Milton's summer program is a monumental experience for anybody who comes into the programs. He draws people from all over the profession. This is not somebody just coming to school. These are people who've been working for years. And what he does is he gives them this wisdom as well as tests them. His curriculum is a constant, let's call it boot camp. I mean, he takes a problem and he has people solve it in a very short amount of time. So it's really testing both sides of the brain at once. And if they can succeed, great. If they fail, even greater, because then you get his wholehearted wisdom.
So I want to just,
I took his class when I was 17. I began to realize we were not designing objects like book covers. We were redesigning the world. I don't think I've ever heard him say we have a responsibility. It swims into the consciousness by his actions. To have spent time with him and not feel responsibility would have been to not be paying attention.
The ripple effect that Milton has had is enormous. People who come out of those programs, there are certain epiphanies that they have, and they go back into their jobs with this new inspiration. Or, as our students do, they go back into the world with a toolkit that they can draw on at any given time. It's not a specific thing necessarily. But in the case of one of our students, Deborah Adler, her thesis project was to repackage and redesign prescription drugs.
My grandmother was taking an antibiotic, which is what my grandfather was taking. Her name is Helen Adler and his name is Herman Adler. She accidentally took his drug, which was a higher dosage. Nothing bad happened other than the fact that she got dizzy, but it was enough to make me aware of the packaging.
at one point, we thought it should be something that the federal government would mandate, and wasn't going to happen. The government would never get behind it. It would take 35 years for anything to happen and so on. So I had a connection to Target.
Who then ultimately bought the whole concept and rolled out a new prescription drug package that has become the paradigm of design in the service of society and the service of culture. I mean, without Milton's aid and enthusiasm, this would never have happened. And this is the highest bar. There are middle bars where, thanks to Milton, people are just practicing in a different, more thoughtful way. It's not about design as service, it's a design as cultural value.
I learned a lot about teaching from studying with Giorgio Morandi years ago. What the students get from a good teacher is not instruction. What they get is a demonstration of someone's view of life. I mean, that's what you teach. You teach a way of perceiving the world. His entire life was about the work. There was nothing else. I thought, no matter what you're doing, whether it's painting or typography or even working as a waiter in a restaurant, that complete commitment is transformative. I mean, it makes you different when you truly commit to what you're doing. I went to Italy having never left home before. I guess I was 20 or 21, smart-ass Jewish kid who really figured I knew the way the world worked. And then I went to Italy and I realized that I didn't know anything about anything. And it gave me this sense of the continuity of human history, of human experience. I mean, going from, the Romanesque to the Gothic to
It's a kind of old place.
right. It's an old place, and it's all, but more importantly, it's all visible. It really shifted me from the idea of modernism as being the only available resource to draw on for a young designer. I suddenly realized history was not the enemy, that you could use anything as raw material to make something. That was a great transformation for me, and it's persisted to this day. I mean, in that sense, Italy was very important to changing my view of, the importance of food. My mother was a terrible cook. I got to Bologna, the best place for eating in Italy, and suddenly I understood something that I'd never learned in the Bronx.
Let me say a few things about his mother's spaghetti recipe.
She would take a pound of Muller's spaghetti, which was as a brand much less intimidated than Buitoni or Ronzoni, and so it sort of sounded a little Jewish to my mother. And she would boil it in a big aluminum pot for about an hour.
And she puts on it some Velveeta cheese
And about a half cup of Heinz tomato ketchup.
and bakes it. Bakes.
And then allowed to cool, and she would demold it. She would take it out and sort of looked like the dome of St. Peter's.
Abraham, guess what happens next?
And then she was slice it
And fries it.
and fry it in chicken fat.
From that to Ristorante Diana in Bologna, it's a long way. It's a very long way.
One thing I can tell you about Milton is that he loves food and he loves to have lunch.
Okay, so here we are in one of the great dim sum palaces in Chinatown. My favorite way of eating. A lot of little things.
When he was at New York Magazine, he had several regular lunches with Jerome Snyder, who was his partner at the Underground Gourmet. So they would invite 3 or 4 people and we'd go to some Polish delicatessen or cheap coffee shop or whatever. But we'd always have these wonderful lunches because we'd have to sample everything on the menu.
So what you would do is you would go into ethnic neighborhoods. You would always find small restaurants catering to the local community. It was the first time anyone had ever written about cheap restaurants. Well, cheap restaurants don't advertise in magazines. But the great thing about it was that it really had a profound effect on eating patterns in New York because we made it acceptable for the middle class to eat in a cheap restaurant. And I think maybe that was the best thing I ever did because it began, we were certainly not solely responsible, but it began that shift of the city's awareness of this incredible reservoir of interesting food that was in this city already. And then the realization of the diversity and the richness of this available good quality food. Because if you went in a Hungarian neighborhood, they were not going to be serving lousy Hungarian food. But that idea that it was okay to go to a cheap dive to have a good meal was really something that the Underground Gourmet brought to the surface. And a lot of things happened as a consequence of that.
Do you still enjoy going to offbeat, inexpensive restaurants?
I love going to cheesy restaurants. I mean, there are a couple in my neighborhood down on 32nd Street, but I'm not going to tell you.
No, it would ruin them. Yeah.
Absolutely.
In his work, food is a major issue. Because for him, food is nurture, food is warmth, food is generosity, food is sharing.
I experience the same satisfaction from preparing any dish that requires cutting and chopping and arranging as I do when I'm drawing. I mean, I don't view those as different kinds of experience.
Milton's love affair with and his expertness in food has informed his design of menus, restaurant interiors, and for that matter, restaurant concepts.
That's the big nose. This was a disreputable old Irish bar, and to Shelley Fireman's credit, he saw that it was a unpolished diamond. And so we completely ripped it apart and designed it so that it would have a series of unfolding experiences. The bar, informal and friendly. We have the grand room, which is a paraphrase of the Accademia where I studied in Bologna. So you have this skylight, this north light. I hired a painter named Elliot Levine to do these fake Renaissance details. And then I also commissioned a friend of mine, Jordan Steckel, to do enlargements of details of the body to signal the idea this is an art school. I don't know how many people get that, but I like that idea that after eating here for 10 years, one day you look up and you say, oh, I get it. I love that kind of sustained mystery. This day I get it remade into fancy apartments, huh? This old building, that's a new development. It really was once a refuge for people who couldn't pay adequate rents. We got our apartment, which was a floor through, for $135 a month. That wouldn't get you very much in New York these days. Well, here is a sadness. I was going to show you my old building. It's gone. 54 St. Mark's Place used to be here. Gone. Absolutely, completely gone.
When we returned from Rome, we found an apartment on St. Mark's Place where we stayed for 18 years. And then we bought this apartment 30 years ago.
What we have on the walls here are my first purchase in the realm of art, which was a Picasso lithograph, magnificent one when he was influenced by Ang, and an odd painting of a man on a fantastically armored horse that I bought while we were living in Rome in a flea market for $2 that was covered over with a crudely drawn cowboy on horseback. I took it up to the house. I told Shirley, we have something under this, and I think it might be Uccello. So I cleaned it with turpentine because I saw that the painting underneath was in egg tempera. And this extraordinary figure emerged. Maybe 10 years later, I was looking at a book of Giacomo Bellini's, and I found the exact drawing. Whether it's Bellini or not is arguable, but we like to think it is.
Of all of the things that we've collected, the African has lasted longer and deeper.
In African culture, the word for good and the word for beautiful are identical, which is that link to the notion of beauty and good, which we sort of skirt about, is actually explicit in African culture.
One of my friends said that made her very uncomfortable, having all these stare at her. They don't make me uncomfortable at all. They're my friends.
When we come home, we feel as though we're at a party. I've done any number of children's books with my wife, Shirley, and that's always been an interesting back and forth process. At the end, I always felt that the conversation made for a much better product than I could have done with a more compliant partner. The first year we were married, we started working on a children's book called If Apples Had Teeth. We enjoyed that experience so much that 40 years later, we did another one. At any rate, that was the Alphazets. We helped in the color palette. We designed the basic logo and all their communications. We designed the landings. Well, this is a wall made of steel, but gilded in copper. And it reflects all the light coming in through the windows, and then at night has very different characteristics. It's basically based on the Tibetan cloud drawings that I discovered, and then rolled so that the forms would open up. All along the way, we had no idea what it was going to look like until it was installed. It has a very different character.
Very beautiful.
At this side, right? I mean, this opportunity was great to actually learn more about Tibet, particularly in the Himalayas. I mean, my interest has always been not about the differences in art, but their commonalities. And what you find is whatever you learn goes into the next project. So I don't look at these so much as being separate things, but rather as a kind of continuum. I've always had an interest, at least as most people do, in what is called the spiritual side of life. I mean, that intersection between religion and belief and making art and a sense of community, and all those things that are involved, a departure from the material world. All of that has shaped the kind of interest, even though it hasn't coalesced into hard belief. I think you have to hold your beliefs lightly.
Unexpected pleasure.
Peter, you know George
I
Lang.
do. About 1990 or so, my friend and partner, Ronald Lauder, decided to buy something extraordinary in Budapest, this incredible restaurant complex called Gundel. And the first thing was, what's going to be the logo? And of course, the first thought I had was Milton. And I found a letter and a menu and a couple of other things from the beginning of the century. And it had an elephant in it. And Milton, about 2 weeks later, made a presentation. Amazingly, Milton, without knowing anything about it, came up with the same logo, which was there 100 years ago. Milton has two things. He's able to put together the technical equipment of creating things, actually making it, knowing what you have to worry about, and something else, the spirit, which comes from heaven knows where.
When you're sitting with Milton, you have one of the graphic geniuses of not only the United States, but of the world, in my view. So I have to admit that in those first few meetings many years ago, I mean, I've been working closely with Milton since '85. He's intimidating. He can be intimidating because it's the breadth of an intellect allied with a vision. And so in those first few meetings, was I a partner in that? Probably not. I was more a disciple and a student. And one remains that. But what becomes clear with Milton is that there is a sweetness there. And there is a humanity. And there is a spirit of wanting to be of help in bringing your ideas and your message with more power to a broader audience. So it kind of melts away the fear factor, which is something that Milton's always working against anyway. He and I've had long talks about the importance of fighting fear, which is so prevalent in these times. He has a great sense of the nation's history and its place in our culture and politics. And so he has that in the back of his mind, that the redesign, be in sync with that spirit. And I think the great designers have that sense of continuity and change. And Milton has that as an abiding vision. He's so articulate. So there's a great kind of dynamism between the visual product he'll show you and as he explains it. And those meetings are wonderful. Occasionally he'll email a note, which is also great to get, but to hear him explain the vision is priceless.
Well, for a while now, he's wanted to work with people that he likes. He's always had that feeling, but I think at times he did things that, were necessary.
When I was younger, I could do anything.
Yeah, you told me this was an evolving
I could do
problem
anything.
and an evolving.
I could make a fruit pie out of shit.
Yeah.
I mean, there was nothing I wouldn't, because I felt, geez, I can learn something doing this. Now I realize I can do very little with anyone where I don't feel sympathetic. There were two guys who came to see me about 15 years ago, Tom Potter and Steve Hindy. It was a time at the beginning of the microbreweries, and they wanted to call it the Brooklyn Eagle beer. And I said, first thing I can tell you is, since you can basically own the entire borough, call it Brooklyn, you have an extraordinary resonance and history.
I had a very difficult time meeting this guy. The first time I called his office, his secretary, Eva, basically told me to get lost. She said, do you know who Milton is? And I said, yeah, I hear he's pretty good. I'd like to talk to him. And she said, well, he doesn't just talk to anyone who calls here.
Well, we did get a lot of crank calls during that period.
it sort of spurred me on, so I started calling there every day and badgering Eva. One day she said to me, "You're not going to give up, are you?" And I said, "No, I want to talk to Milton Glaser." She said, "Okay, here he is." And put him on the phone. So I kind of blurted out my idea about starting a Brooklyn brewery, and Milton said, "Wow, that sounds like fun. Why don't you come in? We'll talk."
An amusing story. And also, I don't seem to get as much work as I'd like. Well, I have to admit, I've been at so many startups that have failed. I have no idea we will get this far.
Yeah,
And the company is in such wonderful shape.
and now we're looking to build a brewery twice as big as this. Be the next step.
This was a first, a bottle that people think has a reference to the Brooklyn Dodgers, but there was no letter form that looked this way. They just had the words Brooklyn Dodgers in normal type. However, people are so convinced that it has some reference to the uniform that the association is convincing.
Maybe it's time for a beer.
Ah, that's a good idea. What I like is basically working on all levels of the culture, from the high to the low. Because the idea behind all of that is that whatever the level is, excellence can always exist on that level. So a good ham and cheese sandwich is really every bit as good as a creme brulee. In fact, it's better than a creme brulee, but each form requires its own level of intelligence and passion. The idea was to do a mural above this entryway. And I saw that the lights that they had chosen create this series of arches. Any mural you put up there would in effect be destroyed by the lights. So I used that arch thematically so that it would look as though you had actually planned on it. The race starts slowly, but the designs on these wheels were based on an idea that Marcel Duchamp had. He made these rotoscopes. If you look at them, the objects and the forms seem to be moving independently of one another. And as they accelerate, they sort of change their meaning.
What happens in the end is that the people, the faculty, the staff, the students are profoundly affected by what happens in the design. In the end, the most important audience, I think, is internal. The way they feel about the place makes a difference in their learning experience. So this September, Stony Brook will take over Southampton campus from Long Island University. So we're thinking of creating a kind of austere, sustainable place that is some combination of the WPA, the Peace Corps, the kibbutz. Well, here are some of the signs we're playing with a new campus, and we introduced this idea of a little wind-powered whirligig to get the idea that we're concerned about sustainable energy. It happens you and I have been talking forever about ecological sustainability and how we get over to this generation of students. It has to be not just what they get in class, but the way their entire experience happens. And that's why you're thinking about it, is shaping of what we're doing. You're not just about pictures. You're not just about designs. You're about ideas. You're about words. We need that in the world these days, that we need a more generous view of what life and education is about. People are so anxious to sacrifice for what they believe in now that it's the right moment for this sort of thing. But potentially, at least, it could be the biggest, at terms of its impact and meaning, the biggest thing that I've ever worked on. We are in a show at the School of Visual Arts that is based on a book I did with Mirko Illich called The Design of Dissent. More than anything else, what you feel is the energy of commitment. People really care about things that are in the air. It's so different from the persuasion and most advertising that you see that it's refreshing.
in New York, the design profession is mostly used by commercial purposes. That's what pays it. There is art you do free, and there is design you do for money. He has come to the conclusion that essentially the job of advertising is to lie.
The saddest thing is that when people experience television and know that it's lying, which is say, or misrepresenting the advertising that you see, they'll still go out and buy the product. But I think this has a real correlation between what happened in American politics. A few weeks ago, I had a roll of vinyl bags in my closet that someone had bought for us at a dollar store. And it was extremely cheap plastic, so that when you pulled it out of the box, it tore, and you could just puncture it with your hand. I said, we're super enthusiasts. And I saw the name of it was Super Tough Vinyl Bag. It's like Bush. One thing we had learned is that all you have to do is repeat it often, right? I know when I was growing up in the Bronx, I was born in 1929. I grew up in basically a left-wing neighborhood of the Bronx. It was called Little Moscow at the time, the Coops, which was basically a kind of socialist enclave by people who come from Europe and who were convinced that they could invent a better life. And everybody was a political activist, because that's what you did. You woke up in the morning and you went out and you distributed leaflets. I mean, that was just normal. The accomplishment of the 60s made us so full of naive enthusiasm about the fact that love could conquer all, and that all you had to do was love. And the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and all these assertions of the young saying it's all possible was an extraordinary moment in time. And here we are at a moment in time where all of that view has been swept away. A triumph, I would say, of a dark vision, of meanness, of stupidity, of arrogance, that seems to be so pervasive all over the world, not only in Washington. But you realize things change, and not necessarily for the better. Then it's simply a condition that you have to play your part, and your part is to be on the side of the lion. I mean, that's my view of it.
Milton is now starting projects, and he'll take them to someone the way he did Buttons for the Nation. The Nation didn't commission buttons. Milton said, you've got to start doing this.
What he has done above and beyond the pro bono work with the design of the magazine is in these last years, he's had these great ideas, and he came to us with this button series. He will send them, in the middle of the night, and there's so much a part of what he's thinking about. Facts, not fear. That is so much part of what Milton believes, the danger of a kind of messianic belief system, much more important to inform and enlighten. So Milton has sent us a slew of buttons over these last few years, which we publish in the magazine and our readers devour, and we take them to student conferences and students love them. And it's always wonderful to see people wearing them, not just Nation readers, but they move around.
If you look at any of his recent work, he's increasingly thinking about world issues and wants to design in a way that can help the causes that he's interested in.
What he brings to this conversation is more than idealism. It's true eloquence. It's more than a doctrinaire philosophy. It's a humanist philosophy. And after all these years of practicing, of seeing design go up and down, graphic design go up and down as a practice of importance, he wants to imbue it with a sense of real gravitas.
Starting 4 or 5 years ago, I realized I didn't have the right to be indifferent or to ignore what was going on. And since I have some talent for communicating ideas, I thought I might use that talent or else feel like a real jerk for the rest of my life.
Milton, he's got qualities and characteristics that are both great and contradictory. He and his wife lead a perfectly private life. He has a house in Woodstock, New York. He reproduced Claude Monet's studio. So he's very, very private in his personal life. But he's the most public man in New York. But public for the public good.
It isn't possible for me to separate my work from my life in general, and certainly not my life from this city. Here you have these extraordinary strands of differences existing simultaneously and in some curious way advantageously towards all of the people who live here. There really is nothing like it. I mean, New York does the job that America is supposed to do. It really takes everybody and not only accepts them, but responds to them. That's a big deal. I mean, if you come to New York from another place, nobody forces you to become a New Yorker in terms of an attitude or a spirit. The city is enormously accommodating, not to mention the extraordinary gift that the city gives you of education. I mean, this is the best town in the world to be educated. The number of schools, the amount of free events, lectures, classes. I mean, no place on earth you can study anything that you want, anytime, anywhere in the city. All of these opportunities, being able to go to the Metropolitan, being able to study at the Art Students League, being able to go to superb high school like the High School of Music and Art, all of that sort of contributed to my well-being, to my understanding, to my history, to my passion. It's not possible. It would not have been possible for me to have been what I am and to have done what I've done any place else on earth. I mean, this is the town that made it possible.